Welcome to another episode of TPM Ridge, the podcast where we bring in industry leaders in technical program management to share their insights, experiences, and the lessons they've learned on the front lines of the TPM movement. I'm your host, Doran Katz, and each week we dive in deep into the methodologies, mindsets, and tools that will empower you to drive excellence in technical program management. Whether you're new to TPM or looking to take your skills to the next level, this podcast is your go-to resource for transforming TPM principles into real-world success. Welcome to another episode of TPM Ridge, where we unpack the nuts and bolts of tech leadership, program strategy, and the art of making things happen. So today we're diving into something that every technical program manager, whether you have battle scars that are fresh or decades old, needs to master, and that's the interview process. It's a really exciting topic, so I'm excited about this. The panel here is as well. So the job market, in case you've been wondering or been living under a rock, has been quite in flux the last couple of years. We've seen waves of layoffs, hiring freezes in many verticals, and fierce competition in others. And at the same time, as we've kind of moved on from COVID, we have AI and automation that are reshaping what must-have skills means. So roles that once seemed to be stable under pressure, roles that combine technical fluency and human leadership are now being prioritized. So getting an offer as a TPM isn't just about what you know, it's about how you package what you know, what you do, how you tell your story, and how you stand out in a crowd. Noisy candidate pool, pretty much. Today's episode's for anyone who's facing the next round of interviews or wants to level up. We'll unpack what interviewers really care about, how to craft stories from mess, bridge technical gaps, and let's chat a bit about our experiences as well. Today on our panel, we have James Dayhoff and Michael Gutz, who's been our regular panelists. So welcome, guys. Thanks for jumping on. Okay, let's
happy to be here.
Yeah. A little bit of lag here. Let's kick things off. Let's zoom out a bit and let's talk about the anatomy of the TPM interview and what hidden skills are hiring teams secretly testing. So, we can talk about, program execution, system design, behavioral questions, metric-based questions. I don't know. Let's open this up. What's top of mind for you guys?
And let's start with an icebreaker.
Yeah.
Do you still know how many interviews you have done in your career? I think I lost track on that, but it would be an interesting statistic.
It's been a while.
Dozens. Yeah.
Dozens. Okay.
Yeah.
4-digit at least.
Yeah. What about you, Michael?
Yeah, I don't know. Like, I think for 4-digit, depending on how you count, like CV scanning or like real interviews, or like what we also discussed today about system design interviews, life challenges, how you combine them, I think.
Yeah, I could probably even say for some companies and some interview processes are so crazy that I probably lost count of how many I've interviewed with that specific company for that specific role. Like Google, for example. I don't know if you guys have ever tried interviewing at Google, but it's probably about 20 different interviews and over the span of months. So it's so it's interesting.
I think an interesting point to maybe start with that we've discussed before is just like how much interviewing has changed. Even if you just look 5 years ago, right? There's two big things in my mind that have totally reshaped how interviews are handled and kind of the expectations with them. And the first thing would be the global pandemic of COVID. That totally transformed expectations and how interviews were either temporarily or how they've forever changed interviews. And then also the advent of AI. And how you can use AI to prepare really, really effectively. But also, I think we have all been in situations where somebody on the other side of the table, an interviewee, is very obviously using AI. And it does not sit well with most interviewers, especially when it's like a behavioral thing, right? There may be different expectations set if it's like a vibe coding interview for different roles. But for behavioral interviews, I've seen it used and it just doesn't land very well. And so I think it'd be interesting to maybe we can start in that direction of those two big events and how they've changed interviews as we know it and kind of what to do about that.
I can take a first pass. So I think what always has been there have been forums like Reddit or any gazillion of forums that explain to you how you pass a Google interview or an Amazon interview. I think AI made it easier to consolidate that information for your specific case, where you can also like put your CV in and how does it fit and those kind of things. And how it changed over COVID. I think the interesting fact about COVID was as well that many companies in tech have been hiring as crazy. And then with this clear paradigm that you need to do it remote, honestly, I'm glad that AI was not so present during COVID times, because otherwise, like I think we would have seen a different tech industry, how interviews would shape out. For the AI, I think and I agree to James, it's hard to guess if the person is using AI. Sometimes it's very obvious, sometimes it's not. My biggest advice to that as interviewer is that you need to always like making an objective what you get out of the interview. So let's take an example. Let's say like you do a system design interview, then for sure the person can answer on that, but it's system design interview can also be partially a behavior interview. How is the person addressing the challenges? The person asking questions back? And this where it gets like really, really obvious that the person can handle very challenging situations where you put them on the spot and then you expose behavioral question, although the interview is about system design. And this makes it very, I think, effective that what we also have also listed down is like interviews on program execution, stakeholder management. I think you need to start in the face of AI, be present in interviews to combine or overlap this certain kind of interviews or mix like how they are like set up.
Yeah, I think, there's a lot of techniques in interviews, like for example, using the star method, right? And I don't think there's anything wrong if you're preparing and just putting all your thoughts and notes in asking ChatGPT to actually put it into a star format. It is your things, and structuring it that way. That's one thing. But I think interviewers, they're looking for cultural fit, and if you're somebody, they're looking for behaviors and things like that to see how you react to different situations. And if you kind of try to synthesize it or try to come up with an answer that's not yours, I think it will come out, one way, if it's not personalized enough, or some way it feels a bit unauthentic. I feel so. Yeah, the pandemic, I guess, I don't know, taking AI aside, interviewing from home has made it easier, I guess, to kind of have notes and things on the side, even if it's not AI generated, I guess. So you kind of have almost like an open book exam type thing, right? So where AI comes in to me is kind of reminds me of when you have an open book exam, but instead of actually having that book next to you, kind of just try copy an exam that existed from last year or the year before or something like that. Like something basically trying to do something in real time, to manufacture something in real time, as opposed to just looking at the notes there. So I think, yeah, those are two interesting phenomenons, I guess, that has sort of come in the last few years. Yeah. What are your thoughts, James? I guess. Yeah.
I think it's interesting. You were mentioning like using AI to prepare, which is such a huge benefit we have now. Looking back to how I would prepare for interviews prior, it was fine, but I can prepare a lot faster and more effectively now with AI. And the things that I do are fairly straightforward. So like you mentioned, you can use it to help put stories from your career into a star format.
Yeah.
And that is so beneficial, because I don't know about you guys, but like I go like month to month, and sometimes all the things that happen in my career and in my job, they start to mesh together, and it's just like this mushy continual story that I'm like, okay, I got to think really hard about how to pull out these stories, how to pull out these experiences and make them market myself to the interviewer, right? So doing that with AI is way better. The way that I've done it in the past is basically like a free-flowing brainstorm through like a voice session with AI, right? Typically, I've used ChatGPT, and I start the voice session with ChatGPT, and I say, hey, I'm going to talk through an experience I had in my career, and I want you to help me craft it into a better story. Don't make things up that I didn't do just to make me look better. Don't just agree with me, but help me pull out the elements that will help me do well in this type of interview. And so then I go in and I just kind of walk through it, right? No pressure. I'm not trying to format it. I'm not trying to make it polished. I'm just walking through it, trying to relay my memory. And it's really, really neat what comes out on the other side is the stitched together proposal that needs a little bit more refining, but it's like, hey, this is a good leadership moment that you should pull from this. Hey, this is a good example of how you were a communicator. And being able to pinpoint those just through story, like it's not even a story that I'm saying. It's just like I said, free flowing thought. And then I would take it one step further with AI as well, is you set up a new session with the voice enabled and you give it all the context for the interview. You say, here's the job posting, here's my resume, here's what I think they're going to be asking about, here's the type of interview. Maybe it's a communication stakeholder management interview. Be the interviewer and I'm going to be the interviewee, and as you ask questions, dive deeper with one or two more follow-ups and interview me, right? And then give me a rating afterwards. And so if you go through that, it may or may not give you the exact feedback that you want, but you being able to just practice getting those words out and having something respond, and then being able to respond back to something, you get some of those nerves out, right? The nervous jitters of doing an interview, because the last thing you want to do is show up to an interview having never spoken the words to the questions that they're asking you. You want to be prepared with like, hey, I've kind of practiced this a little bit. I know the stories I'm going to tell, and as I listen to the questions, I'm going to try and adapt these stories, but I've done it enough times to where I can be adaptable. I can have an effective narrative to the career and the things that I want to communicate. So those are two instances that I found really helpful. I guess just like to summarize, that would be like the finding your stories and then practicing telling your stories. Those are two use cases of using AI for interview prep that is really, really valuable.
And maybe there's an advice for everyone out there. Um, it, Although like you're not interviewing at the moment, what I always like to do and what I advise my team also to do is like to maintain an so-called achievement log. So I've worked like every month, like you just write down, this is what I've done, this is maybe the dog attached to it, and has been the impact. And when you come into a situation, then it's similar to like end year performance, like where like everyone starts to think like, what have I done the last 12 months, and then you need to scrap it together. But if you have a consistent thing of an achievement log in place, then I think like you can do like a very good input that is being delivered to your preparation for the interview in case you end up in that situation. Like Dorian, what you said, like the job market is in flux.
Yeah. I have one of those. I don't call it an achievement thing. I call it my brag doc. So I get to brag things that I'm doing. It's hard to do that in other avenues, but when it's just a doc that you use for yourself, it's really helpful. I love that tip.
I don't know. When you said that, I thought of Captain's Log, Star Trek,
Yeah. Yeah. That's what it sounds like.
Yeah. So this is interesting. So I guess when we're looking over the last couple of years, we talked about, interviewing from home, remote interviews and things like that using AI. I guess for TPMs, do you think there have been changes in specifically the types of interviews that TPMs themselves have faced, aside from, pandemic or AI, any tooling or environmental changes, I guess? Yeah. Anything you guys have noticed that has changed in the role of TPMs that have been being asked?
I've seen one additional question come in more frequently. Then this is through like talking to peers, and seeing interviews myself, is like just the question of like, explain how you use AI for your own productivity. That's a pretty basic, straightforward question, but I've seen it more often. And I think interviewers are becoming more curious about how it is being leveraged. And if this person is forward thinking and saying, how am I adapting to change? Right.
Well, let me ask you that question then. I guess if I were interviewing you, so how do you use aside from preparing for interviews, how else would you use AI in the day-to-day life of a TPM?
Man, this is a rabbit hole. Are we going to go down this rabbit hole? I'll give some quick hitters of like ways that I've used it and I've seen net positive. There's a lot of ways that I've experimented with. Some have been more toil than helpful, but there's been a lot of ways that have been net positive. So one of the things that we commonly do as technical program managers is that we write plans, right? We need to draft ways to accomplish a thing. And this usually relies on product management writing up some type of product requirements or specification. There's also usually an aspect of engineering coming up with like, here's a proposed solution, but neither one of those are plans for execution, breaking things down into milestones. So in the past, you'd have to really kind of dig deep on digesting those documents, understanding them, probably talking to the people who wrote them to really understand the nuance. And you should still do those things, but you can accelerate that with using AI. And so by dropping some of those documents in, those artifacts, and saying, hey, I need to make a plan for this, you can pretty reasonably get 80% of the way there. I would never trust it to make a 100% ready to go execution plan, but you can get 80% there with AI proposing some best practices of execution. It can identify dependencies between, maybe there's multiple engineering solutions that need to be implemented for this PRD. So it can start to draw some of these conclusions and these dependencies and propose them in a plan of how we can think about executing on them. So like I said, you get 80% there way faster. And then the last 20% of that is hashing out the nitty gritty, kind of gnarly aspects of it that are much harder to determine just through an AI trying to understand it. And so if you can focus on that harder to solve 20%, but have the 80% pretty quickly delivered, like your value as a TPM and the impact you're having just explodes in a good way, a good explosion.
Yeah, I think this might be a topic for like a full episode.
Yeah,
but I want to double down what you said, James. I think we see, and I have to confess, I asked the question on AI use cases in TPM interviews, like how they applied AI on their daily doing within the company or outside, just to exactly what you said, bring up that. The other way, what I did with my team, we had a hackathon last week so that everyone gets 4 or 5 hours hands-on in building a use case for TPMs. And one of them was, James, what you said, like we had a quarterly plan from a team. And what you normally do, like you go to Jira and then you hack in the epics and buckle it down. What we did is we used Cursor in order, which is using the Jira MCP server where you can set up rules and then automatically epics are being generated. And this small thing saves you so much time. And coming back to the interviews, this is a very good use case. If when you ask that in an interview, you immediately feel that a person has applied AI and not only let it apply to you. And this will, I think, like also strengthen your imposture in the interviews itself, because you then have something new for your brag log or captain's log to show, and you can immediately bring that to yourself. One interesting question would be how much of these things you should bring in interviews proactively to the interviewer, or are you waiting to be asked for it? I think this is like always another question that I want to throw out there. I had, for instance, certain candidates, and they sent it me even before the first interview, and full. It was like a Miro board where they laid out the full architecture of our product, which was quite good with being an outsider. And this definitely made the candidate stood out from the rest of the pack, and this was actually very good. And I think similar to AI in interviews, like I think you shouldn't send your portfolio to the interviewer or like do this kind of things, like these aggressive things, but you should, I think you should, like in specific situations, position yourself with certain things that you have done which are living on the technology edge at the moment.
Wow.
That's really cool.
Yeah, I like that MCP example. Yeah, we're actually playing around with that as well the last few weeks, with the Jira MCP, and even as a TPM, I kind of combined that with code vibing, and pretty much told that my terminal tool, get this issue, create a feature branch, look at the requirements, build it. And for me, I even sort of cut out the engineers, at least for prototyping, or at least getting the first few phases of development. And I even used to actually create or flesh out user stories or tickets to actually add user stories, acceptance criteria, and things like that. And they take a first go at it, and then I help out. The other thing that I've been finding for TPMs especially, that's quite useful, is not just asking ChatGPT, but using in an agentic way. You can actually, there's some frameworks where you can actually have one agent create, for example, the quarterly planning, and then another agent act as the editor or reviewer, and then you have another agent, basically this. You can have multiple agents work together, and that actually I find has made the final output a lot more closer to what you would do anyway, and less changes and tweaks. So yeah,
That's cool.
but
One of the questions that I've seen, going back to your original question of, what do we see that is asked, relates a lot to the remote nature of a lot of companies now, which is now quickly turning hybrid. And just it's not a complicated question, but how do you work across a hybrid team or a distributed team? And it's not a new question either. I think this has been asked even before 2020, but I think it's more common now to where we have to consider, for example, like communication strategies for a large initiative. How do you design that for a hybrid team that may or may not be in the office, or may or may not be in the same office at all? So that's one that I've seen creep up as well in terms of regularity.
Yeah, and you can test that quite good. So I think we see a little bit of shift in coming from COVID where everything was remote and then going into this RTO slash hybrid slash remote setups across the tech industry. What I, as an interviewer and hiring manager, always try to do is at least try to invite the candidate once to the office. It doesn't need to be this full day of 5 interviews. You can also do that. I think this is very helpful. If the challenge there is that you don't have all the interviewers in the office, like it's like a chicken egg problem. And but at least invite them to the office, because with that you can also test them a little bit on how they would behave if they would be in the office. Because I see a lot when they're getting hired in interviews, the teams are meeting on site at least like quarterly or for a certain frequency. How is their behavior inside the office environment and towards like other colleagues, and then you for sure can get a peer to quickly interview them. And I think this helps also to strengthen the decision on candidates, and this brings this human touch a little bit back to the interviews. And I think as a hiring manager, this gives me so much insight. If they come to the office and see, for 90% of the people, I would say that you throw them out of their known environment, which is remote for nowadays. But this gives you also a very indirect thing next to like program execution or system design. So it's a very deep behavioral face-to-face interview.
yeah,
Really like that.
yeah, I like that too. I mean, I think, we talked about how competitive it is, the last year or two, in terms of the environment, all that. And I think being there in person, I think for an interviewee as well, I think it's advantageous to be able to show that personal touch, to be able to have that, show them how you are in location as well. And I think it gives you momentum as well. I find doing interviews remotely, especially if they're spread out over a few days or over a week or over 2 weeks, you kind of lose momentum. You kind of go in ebbs and flows, but you don't have that. For me, at least, I don't have the consistent sort of performance that I want to achieve, I guess. So but it's interesting. Yeah, do you guys have any, I don't know, do you guys have any insights in terms of, I guess, interview expectations between different companies, large companies, small companies? I guess not recently, but I mean, I don't want to call it out, but I mean, over the last few years, I guess. Your last role, the role before, and all that. Anything that you've noticed it's been different or unique that could be helpful? I don't know.
For I think for bigger companies, they have very structured process, and as an interviewer, you have clear guidance on what to do at a certain stage. And as an interviewee, you or applicant, you also have a good expectation level. And I think when you look into specifically in the AI tech space, how many companies are being funded and invested in, I think they don't have that like proper process. And as
Hmm.
an interviewee, like, or as an applicant, you have way more or higher uncertainty that you need to face in that space. And it could also go like to the extreme that people are getting hired, like sharing their CV directly with some manager and then going to the office and getting hired straight off. I think there's the challenges for smaller companies to find the right talents out there, and for the applicants, like if you say like I want to do something new outside like of the big, I heard like Mango companies is now the new word, or
Oh, yeah.
Mango, that you have, I think, a better chance to also tap into a quicker hiring or getting hired if you could stand out way more. And for bigger companies, I think the changing the process will take ages to amend
Mm.
them. Although they're like very creative in putting AI into the interview process.
Yeah, I guess my anecdote is working at Amazon. I was part of the interview loop for quite a few candidates, and it's quite structured. They have their leadership principles, and they kind of expect the candidates to kind of mention that or kind of wave that into their answer somehow. And then you have like a panel, and you also have what they call I think an interview champion. It's somebody who's not part of the org or part of the team, who doesn't have a vested interest basically and can uh the candidate basically, so that way you cannot really just get someone off, that a friend of yours to kind of just come on and pass that. So some are pretty rigid. Some smaller companies, I guess, like you said, there's more flexibility. I find that it costs a lot more to hire a bad person and the person that it is to, it has a big impact on the culture as well, that I've seen go that way. So
Yeah, well, it's interesting that you mentioned that. Like these big companies, yeah, definitely have more structure. And then there's two things on my mind. I remember when I was leaving ExxonMobil, which is a huge company, right? Just massive company, globally distributed. I was trying to leave ExxonMobil, and the consistent theme that I noticed when I was interviewing places, because most places are smaller than ExxonMobil, they would ask questions like, how would you change the way you operate, knowing that this is a smaller company than what you were previously in? So they were looking to understand my own awareness that coming from a big company typically has more process and the culture is very different. And they wanted to make sure that there was like a good fit for culture and a sense of urgency, because those things are very, very important and almost like a differentiator a lot more in smaller companies. And so it's really interesting trying to leave. I had to become very self-aware of what those changes would be like. I'd say the other like really big difference that I have noticed over the years is smaller companies tend to have a less, Michael, I think you said it, less a structured approach, right? And as an interviewer, that can be, as an interviewee, that can be really hard, and you have to be very proactive. And what I mean by that is they may not tell you exactly like what the content of the interview is, or they may not be as invested or have as much capacity to set you up with, these are all the things that we're going to be asking about. These are our expectations. Here's some resources to help you do your best in the interview. You see that a lot with the companies like Amazon, Microsoft, Google, that they try to give you things to be successful because they know they have a pretty rigorous process. Smaller companies, the interviewee has to be a lot more proactive. And if you don't have some of those details, you have to find a tactful way to ask about it, right? Hey, I noticed I have a couple interviews on this day, and there's a general topic of leadership. Is there anything specific that you're looking for? So as I prepare, I can make sure to speak to some of those things. And just being able to have those conversations with less structured interviews is really important and kind of sets you apart as well, showing that you're thinking forward, you want to do your best, you're curious, and you're not afraid to interact a little bit more and try and understand what they need.
Yeah, I agree to that.
yeah. So something I was wondering about, I guess, so not necessarily something that's new as far as new phenomenon or anything like that, but interviewing a TPM, I guess. So the technical portion. What are the expectations you generally think for or expect of a TPM, I guess, in terms of depth versus breadth, right? So how much engineering they need to know, how technical should they be in various topics, and how do you separate a good TPM from a great TPM, I guess, as far as technical depth? You guys have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think when you have an open position as an interviewer and you have a certain interviewer pool or people that help you hiring, then you need to outline to the peers on what you're looking for. And this cuts a little bit into the fact that you always, in a bigger company, look for specialization in TPMs. In smaller, you look for more the general TPM. And when you then go down into the system design interview step, and I don't want to expose too much on how we do interviewing, but if you look into the challenge, you need to design the challenge in such a way that you can ask the right question depending on the person as well. So the person could if you look into TPM, then the person could be strong on the program management side. And for the technical side, you always, as an interviewer, need to ask the question, is this the right technical depth that a person brings along? Because when a person is more like on the platform side, and you might potentially go down more the route of like database or infrastructure discussions. Whereas on the front end, where you have like quicker iterations, you might emphasize more on the program management side. But I think you need to have what we do internally, like have a set of evergreen questions, those 8 questions on our side that you go through on a technical side that everyone needs specifically to answer. And then you always get a good sense on where the person stands. And you need to also have the flexibility in the interviews to go deeper if you want. And for an applicant, I think nowadays it's with the accessibility to information or like newsletters like Go, like you can get yourself into a very solid foundation of what system design means. And what I value most is when they not only bring the concept of explaining what a load balancer is, but they could also apply it to a specific example. And this is what I like most, that it's not only the regular foundation that you have, but also how you could apply to the use case that you're being asked to. And this, and also the A star is, from my point of view, that you can also relate it back to the company's product that you're interviewing to. In our case, you can always like very good relate that back to how it might help the company. So it's threefolded, like foundation, you know what it is, and then apply it to the company that you're owning to. And this is coming back, like AI could also help you with answering or preparing that question beforehand.
Yeah, good points. One thing I would say that every single TPM should have is this is so basic for the world we live in. If you are a TPM in software, and that's the software development lifecycle. And so if you're a listener of this podcast and you don't fully grasp the software development lifecycle, I think that's kind of base level before you can even get to the system design stuff. Because if you don't understand the software development lifecycle, your ability to collaborate and to do stakeholder management, create a communication strategy, all the other things will struggle if you do not know the basics of software development lifecycle. And then, like Michael was saying, like beyond that, how deep do you need to be in system design? Hopefully there's a baseline, but it's usually it depends. What does the role call for? Usually you can identify a little bit of that in the job posting of how technical is this technical program manager role. And don't be afraid, even in like if you make it through the resume, review process, you're talking to the recruiter or the hiring manager, asking the question of, hey, I know this TPM role applies or works in this domain, and like this is what the job description says. Is there anything else you can tell me about the technical expectations for this role so I can better prepare? And pulling more of that information out could be helpful.
Yeah, if you're lucky enough to find a recruiter that is able to get that information for you, I think that's fantastic. Once again, depends on the company, depends on
hit or miss
on all of that. So I've been different situations like that, which is interesting. But yeah, I think it's a really strong point you bring up about the life cycle. I think it's sort of the bread and butter that you should have that understanding, should have that comprehension, I think, first and foremost. And then you kind of have to look at the job specs and then look at where you are, areas you've worked in and things like that, your skills wheelhouse, I guess, and all that as well. So technical aside, I guess, I mean, what are other areas, I guess, important for TPMs to be interviewed in, like stakeholder management? Any, I guess, how do you demonstrate, that you're able to bring, clarity from chaos, or handle, competing priorities and, cross team alignment questions and things like that? Leadership without authority. How do you highlight those things, I guess, in your work?
I can do a step into that, like more aligning it with the general like advice. So I think like most interviews, when you see through the interviews, and everything in this interview is about communication and talking. What my advice, for instance, for applicants is as well, like no matter like if you want to demonstrate system design influence without authority, is that you use visuals for that. And what you can always do in every interview, like if it's on site, then you can use a whiteboard. or if it's like remote, then you can also flash like some online whiteboard without like mentioning names. And no matter if it's like influencing without authority is quite hard to judge.
Mm.
But I like this whiteboard and visual approach because this sticks with the interviewer, or at least with me, like very much, that people can draw a few things and how they would do it, how they would structure that, how they would do stakeholder management. But I think the toughest one that you mentioned, Doran, is the influencing without authority. What
Yeah.
we internally did is like we ask ourselves after the interview, have I been influenced? It's a very simple question. Is when you spend 1 hour with a candidate, let's say on a system design challenge, has the applicant influenced you? Because you have authority, like you're the hiring manager, and has the person influenced you to in any kind of way? And this is where you can directly after the interview, you can write that down as like 1, 2, 3 bullets. But this gives you a very good insight, and you can only ask that question a few minutes after the interview when
Mm.
you still have the last hour present, I would say. But this is the
Sell
toughest one to.
sell me this pen, I guess. I don't know.
I really like that question. Has this candidate influenced me? I'll have to use that in the future. I'll add a little bit more on this of like, okay, non-technical, non-AI related things. Like one thing I always try and figure out in an interview is at what scale has this person worked in terms of organizational settings?
Mm.
And the reason I really look for that is sometimes, most of the time, in a TPM role, technical program manager role, it's pretty large scale, right? Like it's more than 5 teams, multiple organizations. Like there's a lot of stuff to orchestrate. And sometimes there are candidates that are trying to get their career to go in that direction and have had more experience as a scrum master, for example, with one team. And so while the candidate may be a very, very good scrum master, it's really difficult to assess scale with them if they've never had that scaled experience, right? So asking questions around that of tell me about the times you've worked cross-functionally beyond one team. Tell me about a time you've had to work across multiple organizations, whether it be engineering and legal and security. Tell me about it, just trying to push on that fact of like, get outside your own team. And even I've interviewed scrum masters who have done a lot of that, who have that cross-functional experience. They happen to be focused on one team, but they start to get into that larger scale coordination. And I want to mention that because being a scrum master does not disqualify you from this role. It's a fantastic like prep role for a TPM, but pushing on that concept of scale is really important to me when I do interviews.
What's one subtle signal that tells you that someone will thrive as a TPM? You mentioned, people who are scrum masters and folks, working different skills, but is there a subtle signal that comes to mind for you guys that you can think of?
When the interview turns into a two-way discussion. Because I strongly believe that the interview process in itself is always a two-way street, and you need to be aligned with the applicant with you. And when an interview turns into a discussion, that's why I always have 15 minutes booked in my calendar after each interview, either like to sum it up or to spend more time with the candidate. This is a very strong signal to me when it turns into a discussion.
Yeah, I was going to say something very similar of when it doesn't feel like an interview anymore, or when I walk away from the interview and I'm like, the way that they handled that problem and that the way they structured it, I wonder if that would work with this other problem we're having over here. Right? Like they're able to share things where it's like, okay, that's fantastic value add to this domain. And
You've been influenced, I guess.
I've been influenced. They did it.
What do interviewers wish candidates would stop doing? Is there anything you can? I know we talked about AI and kind of having a AI screen up where during the interview process. Is there anything else that you think interviewers wish candidates would stop doing?
There's one thing that comes to my mind right away that I'll just jump in and say. Introductions that are way too long. That is one thing that I know interviewees are excited and maybe a little bit nervous, but when an interviewee takes 10 minutes to introduce themselves, it's really tough to to move forward.
Yeah, that's a huge plus one. I would also say that, and if it's like getting in, if candidates tell station by station or company by company on what they have done, I think my tip for that for applicants would be to pick out certain impactful things that you have done and how do they fit into the job you're interviewing for, because it shows the interviewer in itself that you have read the job description, that you have prepared immediately from minute zero on. And then you can also like be, let's say, confident enough and ask the interviewer, like, do you want to know more or should you want to deep dive more? Because you can assume nowadays that interviewers have read the CV. At least in the preparation as an interviewer, you should do that.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, yeah, I mean, your resume is there. I mean, you shouldn't just read off your resume or anything like that. For me, I think it's not just the intro. I think throughout the interview process, you should answer the questions, sort of customize it to the questions being asked rather than just sort of being verbose and kind of going through, half your life story or anything like that. So I think it's being very strategic and scopeful, I guess. And scopeful a word? I don't know. Scopeful. Yeah, it's training.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, stop treating interviews like interrogations, which hopefully the interviewer sets up that environment really well where it doesn't feel like an interrogation. And what does that look like? Well, the interrogation looks like an interviewee thinking they just need to say all the answers and then wait for the next question. Say all the answers, wait for the next question. That is not the best method. And Michael, like you mentioned, like when it's going well is when it is a discussion. There's questions that they come back with. They pause and they say, okay, I think that's answered the question, but do you want to go deeper on that? Because I can. Let's see where this goes. So that would be one thing to make sure to stop doing, is stop thinking and having the mindset of this is an interrogation. I can't ask questions. I can't pause, because that's not what it should be.
Yeah, it's too transactional, I guess.
Yeah, transactional would be a good way to say it.
Okay, well, we're at time here. It's been a great conversation. And in closing thoughts here, I'd love to, if there's any advice you guys can give to our listeners here. It's tough world out there. I know it's very competitive, but in terms of preparing for interviews, both, or trying to the emotional resilience side of it. And if you have any tips, please share them. What are you guys, parting words for you guys, for our listeners?
Interviews are tough. They're really tough. And they're not just tough because the person on the other side of the table wants to give you a bad day or make your life hard. It's tough just because of like the market that we're in right now. And sometimes you may interview really, really well, and that may still not be a good fit for what that team is looking for specifically. And so it's really hard, but this is something that I've tried to do in the past when I've interviewed is decouple my interview performance with the result of the interview. Now that sounds weird, but sometimes if I get feedback from an interview and I seek that, sometimes I'm able to pick apart like, okay, like these were the things that went really well. They were looking for domain expertise over here, and I don't have that. And so being able to pick myself up again and say, I performed well in that interview. It was not a match. I wasn't lucky. So I got to keep looking. And that's really hard.
My thing is one thing, like reach out to peers to help you prepare for the interviews. There's so much great resources out there. And I think if you open LinkedIn, you can just type in technical programmers and you find so much people who can help you. And I want to also take the chance, like for instance, in this TPM community on Slack, there's like Elena who drives mock interviews. She's doing a really great job. If you are in that situation, then I can only recommend to join one of the calls touching on different topics. And I think this also makes you stronger, like when preparing. But you can also, when you have found a job, like give back to the community in helping on what has landed.
It's very profound. Yes, and thanks for the plug there. So if you go to tpmevents.org, you can get access to our a Slack, I think Discord as well. So those are great feedback and great things for you guys to take. Yeah, it is a tough. You have to be resilient, and it's also keep on trying, keep on learning, keep on evolving. Right, from every interview you learn something new. You learn to to calibrate and recalibrate, and do as many mock interviews as you can. Reach out to your peers, your colleagues or ex-colleagues, or folks like that. So, all right, guys. Well, thank you. This has been a very insightful podcast. All listeners enjoy that, and we'll look forward to seeing you guys all next time. And to you guys as well, Michael and James. Have a great rest of the month.
Thank you, Doran. Thank you, Michael.